Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another live stream from the Geo-Institute of ASCE. My name is Brad Keeler. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute. What we have for you today is part 3 of our series on dam safety regulation updates, or updates to the dam safety regulations. How about that? From the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Panel 1 back on March 1st, you got to hear from FERC directly and ask your questions about what was then the upcoming changes. Panel 2 on April 12th, you got to hear from the consultants. Today, you will get to hear from the dam owners themselves. You are not in some kind of time warp. This was supposed to be last week. Of course, we had some technical difficulties and we rescheduled to today. What is today, you might ask? It is National Dam Safety Awareness Day. We did not plan this, but it's a little bit of good fortune. May 31st is also the 133rd anniversary of the Johnstown flood, which is, of course, very tightly linked to National Dam Safety Awareness Day. A couple of things. If you like what you see today, and I think you will, you should do a couple of things. You should click subscribe, you should click get notifications, and we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. My other shameless pitch today will be we have a new shipment of Carl Terzaghi bobbleheads that have just arrived. You can join the 96 Club by making a $96 contribution to Geo-Institute student programs, and one of these lovely bobbleheads will make its way to your doorstep as long as you live in North America. To do that, head on over to geo-institute.org, where you can also find out more about the GI and our wonderful slate of programs. With all of that out of the way, here to moderate today's event from the University of Illinois and from the GI Embankments, Dams, and Slopes Committee, it is Tim Stark. Tim, take it away.
Thanks so much, Brad. And it's great to finally hear from the owners on this important topic. So first thing is I'm going to quickly introduce our 4 owners in alphabetical order. First up is Todd Barber. Todd is the dam safety engineer at the Southern Company and oversees their Georgia Power hydroelectric projects. Todd has a broad range of experience with dams and dam safety during his 27-year civil engineering career. Prior to joining the Hydro Services Group at the Southern Company, Todd worked as a geotechnical engineering consultant in the Atlanta area, working on numerous dams. Todd holds a Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering from Georgia Tech and is a registered PE in the state of Georgia. Todd, thanks for joining us. Jason Cooper. Mr. Cooper is the dam safety engineer and senior civil engineer with Idaho Falls Power, and has been working in dam safety since 2013. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Utah, and Idaho Falls Power is a municipally owned utility established in 1900 that owns and operates 4 dams with 5 powerhouses and 6 generators on the Snake River in eastern Idaho. So Jason, thanks for joining us. David Sarkissian. David is the manager of Dam Safety Services and the chief dam safety engineer for the 26 state water project dams operated and maintained by the California Department of Water Resources, or DWR. Prior to joining the DWR in 2011, David spent 16 years in private consulting in Southern California and Northern Nevada with an engineering, geology, and geotechnical engineering focus. David has graduated from UCLA in 1994, is a licensed PE, professional geologist, and certified engineering geologist in California. So David, thanks for joining us. And last, Gene Circa. Gene is a PhD in PE and is also the chief dam safety engineer for American Electric Power's 15 hydroelectric facilities located in Indiana, Michigan, West Virginia, and Virginia. Gene obtained his PhD from The Ohio State University in 2019 while working full-time for AEP for 9 years, and prior to that for a structural engineering consulting firm, Schaefer Entertainment Structures Group. Gene is a registered PE and structural engineer and has experience designing dams and dam structures, bridges, buildings, and industrial structures, as well as hydroelectric dams. So, Gene, thanks so much for joining us. Okay, let me kick things off based on the first two panel discussions with, I think, the question that came up a lot, and that is the new comprehensive assessments, or CAs, as you've heard about, will demand a lot more time and resources from owners. How are you or your organizations preparing to meet these demands? Will you need changes or additions to your staff? What other organizational changes do you foresee in trying to address these new regulations? So why don't we just go in alphabetical order again? Todd, why don't you start off?
All right, I can do that. So for Southern Company, we've obviously, like a lot of owners, have been kind of evaluating what impacts it may have. Currently, we don't see a need to increase staff. Just to give people out there an idea of what we have. In Georgia, we have 15 dams that are licensed through FERC. That's actually 8 licenses. We have a staff of 3 dam safety engineers and an EAP engineer, so that kind of gives you an idea of workload versus personnel. I have a counterpart in Alabama. They have 16 dams that are regulated by FERC. Unfortunately, I can't remember how many licenses they have. So similar staffing, similar number of projects. So we don't right now see a need to really change our staff levels. We do see a significant need for some training. We have a really good dam safety staff. We don't have a lot of risk people on our team. And again, we're not seeing that our people need to be subject matter experts in risk, but we obviously need to have the background and the foundation to understand the process so we can make good decisions for our company when it comes to when we get into those comprehensive assessments and we get into those level 2 risk assessments or semi-quantitative risk assessments, whatever you want to call it. We are starting to talk to our executive management about the cost, the big one being the comprehensive assessment, the additional costs that may be there through needing the risk analysis and the additional work that's going to be needed there, and possibly some updating or new studies that may be needed. So we are trying to give them an idea of cost. Now, we don't really have our hands around that yet. We have some very rough ballpark numbers we're talking about internally. But that's the big thing there. So I'd say no big changes in staff, definitely some training of staff for the risk assessment part of it and figuring out how we're going to budget for it.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Jason?
So I think for us, as you mentioned, we have four dams. Only one of those is high hazard currently. So changes in staff, I don't see that as a needed, anything that's needed here at Idaho Falls Power. We have had a preliminary discussion with upper management regarding the costs of CAs and the increased costs there, and have kind of told them, look for double of what we're budgeting for now. We are also, like Todd, very slim in the risk analysis department, so the training there would be huge. It's interesting. I've looked at some of the bureau's training. It looks to be fairly comprehensive. It's just finding the time to do it or making the time, I guess. And then this year, for our Part 12 on our Gem State facility, we have that inspection falls under the old regs for us. And in preliminary discussions with our IC, we talked about building that PFM or doing that PFMA in a way that sets us up in a good position for that comprehensive assessment when that comes around. And so those are kind of the things we've been looking at that will be affected for us under those new regs.
Thank you, Jason. David, with 26 SWP dams.
Yeah, so about, we've got 11 that are under FERC license. And so I am seeing, kind of an incremental increase in probably the resource demands and budgeting for those that will be subject to the comprehensive assessment. And then I think, a little lighter lift on the periodic inspection. So it might be a wash overall for us, but we had prior to these regulations, been using the independent consulting teams. We typically would have 3 on a board or a team, using a lot of internal subject matter experts as well as consultant subject matter experts to participate in the PFMAs and now the future level 2 risk analyses. And so for us, it's really a matter of planning and getting out ahead of the deadlines. And so not necessarily huge increases in resources, but just getting better organized, making sure that we're reaching out to those resources, letting them know what our schedule is and where they'll need to plug in to the process. And so that's typically been our biggest challenge, is just getting all that planning done and getting the resources lined up.
Great, thanks, David. Gene, how's AEP handling the new regs and CAs?
Well, similar to the other guys on the panel here, we're kind of in the same boat. We have, of course, 15 hydroelectric facilities. 14 of those are FERC regulated. So I've been kind of preparing ourselves internally for these new regs back when we first heard about them, 5 or 6 years ago, I guess. So we kind of did the last part 12s in our Virginia hydros as if it were a CA, except we didn't do the risk assessment or risk analysis. But we had many subject matter experts that were internal to us. We had kind of 3 ICs, even though one was the official IC. We did have folks that were external partners on those teams as well. So that kind of gave us an idea of what kind of costs to expect a little bit, even though we didn't do the risk assessment or risk analysis. So we kind of were preparing ourselves for these new regulations coming down the pipeline. Internally, we don't plan to staff up and increase our staff, but maybe make more individuals, I guess, hydro educated, if you will, that hadn't but maybe worked on hydro projects before. So there's a lot of training going on, getting those individuals up to speed. And we're really relying on the independent consultant to provide what they need to provide per the regulations. So that's kind of the gist of it, I guess.
Okay, great. Let me shift to some other questions we're getting. How would you summarize the biggest change for each of you between the PI, and that means periodic inspection, versus the comprehensive assessment or CA that we've been discussing? What impacts will this have on your operation, the difference between the PI? And maybe we should go back. The comprehensive assessment is every 5 years, right?
Ten
10 years, I guess.
Yeah, it'll rotate between a PI and a CA every 5 years.
Right. So you'll have as PI, and Gene already said they were working through the Virginia was getting to the CA, but how do you see the biggest change? The question is, what is the biggest change between the PI and CA, and what impact will it have on your operation?
I guess I can chime in a little bit on that.
Yep.
I guess my understanding is that the PI is going to be less costly or less, I guess, financially taxing on us as the typical Part 12. So that I think the idea is maybe to help balance out the extra cost for the CA. So we're planning. We do a 10-year budget, so I kind of threw some numbers in what the PI is going to cost versus CA is going to cost in the future. And like a lot of us, we don't really know what the CAs are going to cost ultimately until we do one. And then we can adjust the numbers after that. So operationally, just from budgeting perspective, we're certainly trying to tweak the numbers so that we're prepared for it in terms of the budget. I don't know if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just we're kind of doing the same thing. When we've thought about budgets, again, not knowing what a CA is going to cost, we've kind of thrown around numbers of 2.5 to 3 times what our previous Part 12 inspection would cost. Again, that's just really talking to some consultants, talking to a few other licensees, and trying to get at least an order of magnitude. One concern we have is the industry has been doing PFMAs, Part 12s and PFMAs for, I guess the first PFMAs were around 2002, 2003. Are we all going to be able to shift gears when we do the first PI and really back off what we're used to doing. Because if we don't, the cost really isn't going to come down that much. And I feel for consultants, because they have to try to price this. We know that they know the expectation is these PIs should be, for lack of a better word, significantly less than the current Part 12 independent consultant inspection. So that's one concern there. And I understand FERC's doing the best they can, but it can't be a one-to-one trade-off. I just don't know yet if the savings in the PI is going to offset the additional cost in the CA, if that makes sense. So it doesn't really change a lot for us, the PI versus CA. I would say, getting a little bit on a tangent concerning the intervals, I think most licensees are trying to do this, but really think about how you want to schedule out your PIs versus your CAs, and work with FERC, because, you know, I think we want to we want to work with FERC on that schedule so that we can do it at our preferred schedule. You know, we don't want to have all of them be CAs right away, but we also don't want all of them at the end of that, I say 3-year cycle, because they're looking at 2038 to have everybody to have a CA done on these high hazard projects. We don't want them all piled up at the end. You know, FERC may have a preference to have a lot of our projects towards the end, but we may want to have some so we can spread that cost out over that 15 to 16-year period that FERC's trying to get all the CAs done.
Right. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
So I had talked with our upcoming IC for this year's, and really, I don't know where we sit in FERC's rotation or whenever they're going to put us down for a CA. I'm hopeful that they kind of have the bugs worked out between FERC and then the consultants by the time we get there, so that it's a little less painful, and maybe that cost of the CA has been nailed down a little more. But you know, I can hope all I want. I guess we'll see how it shakes out.
Right. Okay. All right, so let me go on to the next question, which sort of dovetails with what Todd and Jason were just talking about. How do you envision modifying your RFP process? And that's obviously the request for proposal for consultants to give you a proposal on PI versus a CA. And it seems like you could modify the RFP such that maybe you try to contain the cost on the PI to help defray the cost of the upcoming CA. Just any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. Our process is a request for qualifications, and so we're really looking at fitting the right IC or subject matter expert to the dam, whether that's going to be a PI or a CA. And so we're planning to issue that RFQ early, make it as flexible as possible, and identify that we have needs for independent consultants, we have needs for subject matter experts. We envision kind of mixing and matching to a certain degree to meet our needs, you know, on what expertise on what dam, and also, of course, availability, and trying not to overload any one person or team with too much work in a certain time frame, because we're really sensitive to delivering on schedule and not having to ask for extensions. And so that's one of our key concerns is getting the right or getting multiple teams so that we make sure we get the work done, and we don't end up behind the 8 ball at the end of the process.
Yep. Anybody else want to jump in on the RFP or RFQ?
Yeah, we do RFP, and basically my goal is to get, make sure it's as well defined as possible, so we get exactly, what we want. Yeah, we will. I do plan to scale back when we start doing the periodics to make sure that as long as it's well enough defined, we should be, hopefully the cost will be lower. And same for the CA to make sure that we're getting everything that we're supposed to be giving to the FERC when we do submit that the process and report.
Right. Okay.
Gene, I think that's a good point, that having a well-defined, whether it's an RFP, RFQ, however you procure your consultant, to have it well-defined, especially that PI and the CA, so you can make sure you're getting what you need, meet the regulations, but you are using your company's dollars as effectively as possible. I will say for us, we're actually bringing in some consultants we work with a lot, one or two, maybe three, and we're talking to them. They're going to provide us kind of what their game plan of performing a CA would be, almost like we're bringing them in. I don't want to call them the project manager for us, but especially on that risk side, since we're not as familiar with the risk side, some other licensees may be. It sounds like some have already done some pilot programs, some have already kind of incorporated risk into their Part 12 inspections. We haven't done that, so I think I want to lean on the consultants who have done risk, where they've done it with Bureau of Reclamation, TVA, Corps of Engineers, maybe out in California out west where it seems to be a little more prevalent. But we're leaning on their expertise to help us just kind of develop that game plan, when they understand what we're doing. This doesn't mean they're going to get the first CA that we do. But it is consultants we work with a lot, and they're helping us out to help me understand better what this process is going to look at. So that's something we're in the works right now, that they're trying to kind of come up with a game plan for us. Ours will be much more of a kind of a qualifications-based decision making, like David's, is how we look at it.
Okay. Next question is maybe focused towards Gene, because you have facilities in multiple states, but FERC is a national regulatory agency, of course, and so ensuring consistent application of the new guidelines is a question. At the same time, dams are site-specific, large variations in size, operation, history, etc., and some policy adjustment may be desired at specific locations. How are you going to manage that? Do you foresee any challenges with the first CAs in different regions? Gene, you mentioned you're sort of already working on Virginia, but what about your other states, Indiana, Michigan, West Virginia? Are you seeing any variability across regions?
There's always a little bit of variability across the regions, of course, dealing with Chicago versus New York office versus Atlanta. I did have a sit down or a Teams meeting with the Atlanta office to pretty much go over the schedule of the 6 hydros we have in Virginia and when they expect us to do the first CA. So I was kind of hoping that our Smith Mountain Leesville would have been maybe the next rotation, but it turns out they want us to do it next year. So it's going to be I think the first of the Atlanta regional office doing the CA, and Smith Mountain Leesville will be the first ones of ours also that will be getting the CA. So ramping up for that a little earlier than expected is a little bit of a challenge, but not too unexpected. For the Chicago regional office and our Indiana, Michigan hydros, I did have a phone call with the engineer in Chicago just to get an idea when they're expecting the CAs, and essentially it didn't have the same level of phone calls I did with the Atlanta regional office, but at least I had some idea of when to expect the CAs at those 5 hydros, 5 of the 6 that are FERC regulated. Have not had a conversation with the New York office for the ones in Charleston, West Virginia area, but they're all powerhouses attached to a lock and dam, so they're not quite as critical as the other hydro facilities. So that's kind of how that's shaken out so far.
Yep. Anybody else want to weigh in on different regions? No, we're good. Okay. This question came up in our second webinar. The risk associated with conducting a CA, or comprehensive assessment. Does the engineer who performs, or the consultants who perform the CA, become the engineer of record? What liability might the engineer be assuming or getting attached with via a CA? Or, given we're talking with owners, do you think it all stays with the owners? So whoever wants to jump in.
I'll jump in there. I think it stays with the owner. They're not designing the dam. They're evaluating it. They're providing recommendations. And then us as owners, it's up to us to decide what we do with those recommendations and where to take action. So I think it's with the owner in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. That's basically what I was going to say. That I mean, it's going to be a different service for us, but they're still providing a consulting service, and they have responsibilities, but they also have limitations, and it's ultimately up to the owner to decide what to do with the information we get and the recommendations we get back.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in a little bit on that. I've always treated the independent consultant as independent as possible, to allow them to have the freedom to basically take ownership, if you will, of the process. But ultimately, the responsibility does lie with us, AEP, and how we handle the recommendations, because they are recommendations, they're not mandates per se. Some, of course, we have to. If we don't want to do something, we have to justify to the FERC, certainly, as to why we weren't going to take this recommendation or what have you. So, but the responsibility does lie with the owner, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with the other three panelists, Tim, that the liability has never shifted away from the owners, and I like how Gene stated that, to allow those independent consultants to be as independent as possible, and I agree with that.
Okay. The one part of the new regulations has a change in the definition of dam failure. It's no longer a release of the reservoir. So how is that going to affect your operations, if at all? And then does that mean for the owners, events like muddy seepage, spillway operations, an upstream slope failure like with no release of the reservoir, and I think you can think of one that I'm thinking of. How do those affect the owners, this new definition of failure?
I really don't know if there's that much difference for us, because even if a boat barrier breaks, you got to go fix it. It's a public safety item. It's not a dam failure. And it's really just a motivation of what are you going to fix and at what priority. Anything that affects public safety in one way or the other needs to be fixed as soon as possible. So I guess that's how I kind of look at it.
Yeah, and we were already thinking about the process, and I imagine this is familiar to most licensees, most FERC licensees. We were already working PFMs, potential failure modes, into our analyses that were not uncontrolled release of reservoir. It was just an uncontrolled release, whether it was the failure of a penstock, failure of a sluice gate, failure of just one spillway gate. We were already starting to look at those, and we have for at least 2 cycles that I'm aware of. So they were already starting to get incorporated into our potential failure mode analysis. So it won't be a big jump, a big step to go from that to what we may have to do looking at, like you said. I mean, there may be a few instances where maybe they were, not categories under the old regulations as 1 or 2. Maybe they're a category 4 that maybe they'll get pulled back in now, but I'd expect if they weren't a concern before risk analysis, hopefully they wouldn't be a concern after risk analysis. So, but yeah, so I think it's not going to change our process too much. I don't think it's going to be a heavy lift. And to Gene's point, obviously public safety was already a consideration for a lot of things we do. So, if we had a concern about something like that, we'd already be taking action from an operational standpoint.
That's a good point too. Of course, we had to do the spillway assessments for anything similar to the Orville, and we had one at Smith Mountain, or 2 at Smith Mountain. So we did a focused assessment, if you will, or Part 12 that focused just on the spillways, and we did a separate PFMA for that. We incorporated it into the Part 12 because it was roughly the same period of time. But it had its own report, standalone report, and all that. So those types of structures that are critical to the operation of the facility would be included in the PFMA. Other things that are public safety items that need to be fixed here and there, like the boat barrier, for example, wouldn't necessarily be in the PFMA, but certainly a public safety item that would need to be fixed, signage, things like that, alarms that we might need to have installed. Looking at the inundation maps and the population at risk downstream. And I'm presuming that when we get into the risk assessment, risk analysis, that's what we'll be focusing on is those sorts of things. Again, I'm not fully up to speed on how that's going to work, but we've done similar risk assessments to help management understand the magnitude or the reasons why we have to do certain projects. So that's what we use those tools for in the past, is just to let our management know here's the risk associated with this project and why we need to do it. So I'm thinking that when we do the risk assessment, risk analysis as part of the CA, that should be helpful in that way as well.
Right. Okay, good. All right, so we were just talking about PFMAs, probable failure modes. So with the new regulations and CAs, it's anticipated that there's going to be a large number of PFMs, potential failure modes, for a given project, say 30 to 50. How are you going to handle those different PFMs? Are you going to lump some together, split them off, and keep them separate and have a risk assessment on all of them for a given project? If so, that could be extremely time consuming. So maybe you're not already at this level of how to handle these PFMs, but if you have any thoughts.
So in our last part 12, we went from, and I'm trying to remember, it seemed like somewhere around 60 PFMs to about, I think 104 is where we ended up. So that was a significant jump for us. And luckily our IC went through the machination of actually running it from, initiation all the way through failure. And so in a way, they've set us up, and we're lucky enough to have the same IC this time. Hopefully we can set ourselves up to roll those right into a risk analysis kind of PFMA when we do a CA. So, we've kind of already taken a bite of that apple already. And as far as the rest of the question, I'm not sure. I think it'll flesh itself out again.
Yeah, we've had 4 level 2 risk analyses thus far, and we have seen, just as Jason mentioned, a big increase in the number of potential failure modes being documented and estimated. So we've set up a risk register, database to house those, to track them, and also we've aligned with our asset management program and how we're depicting them on an internal risk matrix. And it's all kind of coming into the fold of our planning and what projects do we want to fund or what risk treatments do we want to take on is really becoming anchored to those level 2 risk analysis results. But it takes time, and it'll probably be another 10 years before we get through all of our dams with the level 2 risk analysis. Even if, and some may not warrant it, small low hazard dam, maybe we don't invest in an L2RA for something like that. But we view it as a long-term, process, and it's going to help refine how we're investing in our infrastructure.
Okay, hey David, Jason came up with 104. You said yours went up. How many PFMs did you have? What's your height?
Well, I think, for a single dam over 100 right now in our risk register, over 400. A lot of them are the damage states, and that's, I think, getting back to that definition of failure. It really opened up a lot of more potential failure modes that you need to describe, and then you got to, like you said, you either got to lump them or separate them, and that's, we rely on the facilitation team to get through that, because otherwise those workshops can go for days and days and days. So.
Okay, Todd or Gene, you want to jump in on PFMs, or you're good? Okay.
I'm good.
All right, yeah. So, boy, it sounds like it's even more than we thought. Okay, there's a seismic question, and the generally what happens when you conduct a CA. Seismicity is reviewed, and usually seismicity increases. So David, obviously this is related to you, maybe also Jason a little bit, being in Idaho. Do you foresee increases in seismicity? And if so, what do you think the ramifications are?
Yeah, we have at a number of our dams. We've tried to get for the larger level 2 workshops, get a probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, in our hands and ready for that effort. So we've got good data to look at. And at the end of the day, the ground motions go up. A lot of our structures start having, issues. Those become potential failure modes, and we get them estimated. And it's a matter of prioritizing a lot of, updated analyses due to the changes in ground motion. So we're seeing a lot of that in California, of course.
Yeah, I don't see a huge change for us. We're relatively quiet seismically, unless, of course, Yellowstone goes, and then it won't really matter at that point. But no, I don't see any changes that way.
Okay, great. Next question is, most FERC regulated dams are oldish, 50 to 100 years, and have been analyzed, inspected, evaluated numerous times. It seems most often each new round of study produces some new understanding. Will this ever stop or plateau? Can a dam or infrastructure element ever be fully understood? Were older evaluations, analyses, techniques a little limited, such that now new flaws or concerns are being identified? So any thoughts about old infrastructure?
I guess I'll start out, and one thing I have to say is, talking about will we ever completely understand our dams? For me, especially on the older dams, the answer is probably no. Because we have a lot of good information. I'm sure a lot of licensees are like this. I'm amazed at the information we have on these dams that were built 100 years, 90 years ago. But, we have this joke here. We can find plenty of blueprints, but today we get as-builts. Well, we have all these blueprints, but it may be 90% of how the dam was built, but something was tweaked. And if we can't find that drawing or can't see it, in person, we don't know if that's exactly how the dam was built. So that's always going to be, I guess you would say, somewhat of an unknown. So I do think it'll probably plateau. I don't know if it'll ever get to the point where we can walk away, say we understand that dam 100%. I just think with it being, and I guess the same thing applies to a new dam. I just think about, our understanding of piping on embankment dams. That seems to, it seems to still be developing. There's a lot. I was a geotechnical engineer before I was a dam safety engineer, and a lot of my friends joked about me working in a black box industry. It was hard to understand the ground sometimes. And so that's those limitations there. So I think to fully understand it, I think and I hope that moving towards the CAs with the risk assessment is going to help us prioritize our potential failure modes better. I personally have not been through one for our company. I've attended a couple to see how they are, and that did appear. I'll just tell you, one was TVA that the Corps of Engineers facilitated, and they had a pretty large group of PFMs, but they were able to pull it down to what they felt were the risk drivers, and they got it down this particular project down to 3 PFMs. Not ignoring the other ones, but it really helped them focus their attention. I think the PFMA process we have now has probably helped us do that, but I'm hoping the risk path will help us do that even more. So I also hope the risk, and again, not being a risk expert, but the risk will help us feel better about the things we don't know on these projects. It'll help us maybe get our hands around it a little better, like understand that we don't know something about the foundation, or we don't know something about how the contact was prepared. However, the consequences are lower. Maybe that's not where we need to be focused. Yes, it's an unknown, but it's not as a concern as a different PFM because there's a much bigger consequence. So I'm hoping that's where it gets us to.
Anybody else? Okay, so we've talked about risk assessments a couple times, and it's come up because now the new regulations require what's called a level 2 risk assessment. In the beginning, a couple people, Todd, I remember you said we need some training in risk. So here's the question. The CA will incorporate risk assessments. How familiar / comfortable is your organization with quantitative risk assessments? Do you use them in other areas of your operation and business besides dams? Todd, if you want to weigh back in on that, but I know you said you were going to need training and maybe one other did.
Yeah, I can just kind of follow up on what I said earlier. You know, I would say as a group, we're not comfortable with level 2 risk assessments yet, but we're working to get there. You know, we're looking for training with the Corps of Engineers, USSD, CIATI. I mean, just anywhere we can get it when FERC starts their training. But I will say, and I also want to mention that I have attended a couple of risk assessments that were done by the Corps of Engineers, one for TVA. So it was good just to observe that being done. But I will say, we see our consultants being, if you want to call it, the subject matter expert on these. I don't expect or need my team to be an SME when it comes to risk analysis, but our group does need to understand the process, like I said earlier, so we can make good decisions for our company with that input from our consultants helping us along the way.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll chime in too, real quick on that. Like I said earlier, we do incorporate risk because every business decision we make to basically spend money on anything we do within AP, whether it be energy generating equipment or what have you. But for dam safety, the same thing. You know, we look at the risk associated with the different options that we're potentially pursuing, and not just the cost. So we have been doing that for quite some time, and then, like I said before, in some special projects, we did do kind of on the level of, I guess, maybe a level 2 risk analysis for some special projects to help sell the project to our management to spend, motivate them to spend the money. But as far as the actual regulations, we all need the training. I need the training, certainly, just to make sure that we meet those FERC expectations.
And Gene, in the other business areas at AEP, do you actually quantify the risk, or you just sort of qualitatively look at the risk?
Those are the broad brush ones are qualitative. The quantitative was the special projects where we actually did quantify risk. So yeah. But that's just for special cases. But for all the business decisions, it's all qualitative.
Yeah.
I guess what quantitative would be the money. If you want to call that a quantity, I guess it is.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question is, maybe Jason, you could start this one off. There are many FERC licensees who only own 1 to 2 high hazard dams. What are some specific challenges from these new regulations for small organizations? How can consultants help these smaller organizations meet the demands of the new regulations?
So, as I said earlier, we have one high hazard dam, and I think for us, part of it is internal, educating management about what the new regulations are, what the requirements of us will be, and how we can meet those. Budgetary, that's going to be, that falls in that same conversation with them to let them know, as best we can, a number to shoot for, and then try to get the most bang for the buck. I think for us being, I don't know of a consulting firm within probably 150, 200 miles of us that would have an SME that could help us out. And so for us, we have to somehow have an appeal to consultants to help us out. And we have a pretty good relationship with a couple of large consulting firms that have helped us out in the past and continue to foster those relationships. But we're going to have to bring in others. We can only use them so many times, as we're all well aware. So I think that's going to be a particular struggle for us. And really, they have to, as Todd has mentioned a couple of times, leaning on those consultants to be the subject matter experts in a lot of these things. We don't have any. I mean, I'm the civil engineer on staff. I'm it, and so, you know, I wear more hats than what was in my bio. I also manage our hydromechanics, and so, you know, my day ranges from. It just runs the gamut, but I think those will be the particular challenges for us, I think.
Yeah. And anyone else? Okay. Next question has to do with, in fact, training specific. So are there any other topics besides risk that owners foresee needing training on to deal with the new regulations? Only risk?
I think risk is pretty much the big one. Of course, there's going to be, I think, 3 different training programs out there. One just for the CA overall, I guess. One for the risk assessment, and the other one for the PFMA regulations. You guys correct me if I'm wrong on that. So we'll certainly take all the training. You know, if anything, a lot of it should be refresher, hopefully. But yeah, the risk is definitely the big one.
I think FERC also mentioned having a hydrologic hazard training session. Does somebody remember that? Like just how to incorporate that? Because I don't necessarily see our team or my dam safety group having to do training in that, but that's, you know, whether it's Heck Life Sim or some other type of thing. But, you know, when we've looked at consequences, though, that's been very qualitative in the previous PFMA process, you know, and I know loss of life, economic consequences, those types of things are going to probably play a big role in this. We're looking at that, possibly likely adding costs to the comprehensive assessments, but I won't necessarily say there's training needed within our team. It just may be, maybe some training just to understand those processes better. Again, because we're going to be leaning on our consultants to provide that to us, but we need to make sure we know enough about them that we can understand what we're getting back and we can make the right decisions for Southern Company.
Okay. All right. So after the PFMA, or the potential failure mode analysis, how are you going to implement the remedial measures / recommendations? So is this where, Gene, you talked about risk qualitative versus quantitative? Are you going to look at each one of these recommendations and then sort of quantify the risk with each of these, or how are you going to implement the recommendation or prioritize the recommendations?
I haven't really thought specifically about that yet,
Okay.
but definitely something that I see it as, kind of like we've been doing with the risk-based technical option type tables, where we look at the different things that we need to address. So I think what you describe is something that we'll have to do for our recommendations. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we're wrestling with that question. You know, coming out of the PFMA or level 2 risk analysis, we start thinking about risk treatments. You know, do we need to get some new monitoring and surveillance out at the dam? Do we need to maybe to have a study or investigation to understand the problem more, or do we want to step into quantitative risk analysis with that issue and dig further using risk? So we're still trying to figure out an internal process to kind of go through those steps, and I think it'll vary also based on the magnitude of the issue. Maybe it's just something you just go fix. It's an easy fix out there, and you just go out there and make a physical change. But yeah, that's that's been our the area we've been thinking about and haven't quite dialed in our process yet, but looking to do so in the near future.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe the physical remediations may be a little simpler than operational remediations. I expect to see some of the ways we operate come into question, and maybe kind of breaking that this is the way we've always done it mentality changing in operation. I think that may be a challenge for us. So something else to look out for.
Okay. Okay. Next question. The comprehensive assessment, or CA, obviously means to really go back and look at the history of the structure. And I think it was Todd earlier said, maybe we'll never know everything about the structure. We have blueprints, but not necessarily as-built for the older structures, so on. Is there anything you are going to do differently in terms of documentation, or what would recommendations do you have for other owners and consultants on documentation so we can find this information easily and efficiently for these CAs moving forward? And of course, for newer projects, how should they handle it? So this is a really big question. So jump in. Anybody?
Well, one thing I thought about is just this kind of goes back to existing dams, but you're doing new analyses on. If you think you've documented enough, you're probably wrong. And what I mean by that is I've had some examples just that I've been involved with where at the time, all decisions were very clear. Everybody was in agreement. We moved on. Several years later, there's a question about something, and I could tell them about the conversation, but I didn't have the details. And then I had to go back and try to find where we documented those decisions were made. And we said that a decision was made, but we didn't provide if you want to say, the support for that decision.
Yeah.
And at the time, it felt like we did. So it's just to really pay attention. And whether you're updating your stability analyses or you're looking at your spillway discharge, just make sure you document really well what the parameters for your design or for the reanalysis, how those decisions were made, the backup information. In that specific example, we had a lot of good information, geotechnical and foundation information. It's just, and we were able to address that question when it came up years later. It just would have been simpler. It would have been a very quick answer during a PFMA review if we would have documented that properly at the time. So I think that's one thing you can do. One thing we've done some of, and we're probably going to do more of in the future, is we're starting to get LiDAR scans of our projects, because we'll have some old drawings, and we'll even have older drawings that'll disagree on some dimensions, on some elevations, things like that. So we're trying to kind of rebuild that information that we don't have. So that's another piece of what we're trying to do. But I would probably just tell people to make sure you document it as well as possible, how your analyses are done, how decisions were made, what parameters you came up with, how you did that. And also look where you may have holes, and I think this process may help us find some of that, so.
Yep. Decisions, document decisions. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Next question is, what type of questions are you receiving from your senior leadership regarding the new regulations and changes?
I think, right off the bat, budgetary questions come up, of course, and the time demands on our staff. But then also, questions are what are the outcomes going to be different, with these new Part 12 processes. And I think, at least for the past 5 years for us, I think it'll be very similar outcomes in terms of the types of recommendations we'll be seeing. I think we recognize that there'll be some analyses we'll need to update, and some other areas that we've seen recommendations on before in the past. And so I see the outcomes being very similar, at least in terms of the Part 12 recommendations.
Anybody else? Any questions from senior leadership? What are they interested in besides cost?
So I'm with David, and the cost initially is the biggest question they have, but I'm not sure they know enough about risk analysis to know what questions to ask. So I think there's an education piece of educating them on what the expectation is, and then the questions I'm sure will start coming.
Mm-hmm. And anybody else? Gene, Todd? Questions from upper management?
I mean, I've been keeping them in the loop on the evolution of the changes, if you will, especially through the CIADI meeting minutes that we've been talking about these new regulations. And so the information's been fed up already. So I don't know if they think, like Jason said, there's not enough information really to ask too many questions at this point.
Yeah.
Aside from the cost.
Yeah. Cost being a big one, obviously. And I've heard double. Okay. I think we are gotten through all the questions. So, oh no, here's another question coming in. No, okay. All right, so great. I think we've gotten through all the questions. So Todd, Gene, David, and Jason, thanks so much for sharing the owner's perspective to the new FERC regulations and guidelines. So it's going to be an interesting next few years and see who gets selected for the CAs and who are the first ones to get to go through the process. So thanks so much for joining us. And let's see if Brad's going to jump back on and say, oh, there's Brad.
I am going to jump back on.
Okay.
Great job, everybody. And thanks to our viewers out there for your questions today and for joining us. And thanks to everybody who joined us for all three parts of this series. This was a great panel, guys, today. The owners certainly answered a lot of questions for us. And that was true with the consultants and with the first part as well. So as a reminder, all three of those episodes, all three installments are available on our YouTube channel, the same place that you're watching this video. We hope to have more content like this with federal agencies and regulations and guidelines in the future. This was a great opportunity for us, and we hope to be able to do something similar again. If you liked what you saw, click like, click subscribe, click get notifications. We'll let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. And I think that is my final announcement. Everybody can have a great summer. Stick with GI as we continue to produce content. We'll see you back in September if you're not gonna if you're gonna go off and hang out away from us for a while. But thanks again for the panelists today. Yeah. Thanks, Tim, for moderating very ably all three of these sessions.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks again to the panelists. Thanks for your responses and frank discussion, certainly about cost. That was a big question in the first two.
And we will see everybody soon.